The Ethics of Benedictus de Spinoza, a work of ethics and theology published in 1677. The principal ideas of which are that whatever is the cause of itself exists necessarily, only substance is self-caused, free and infinite, and God is the only substance. God exists necessarily and is possessed of infinite attributes. But only two of God's infinite attributes are known to us, thought and extension. Since thought and extension are features of the same substance, whatever happens to body happens also to mind as another phase of the same event. A false idea is an idea improperly related to God. By achieving adequate ideas, we become adequate causes of the body's modifications. This is human freedom, freedom from the human bondage of the passions. The highest virtue of the mind is to know God. Spinoza's Ethics is an extraordinary work, in which it is subject to great differences of opinion. It has always been recognized as a classic by people of most diverse interests. While other philosophers come and go in popularity, Spinoza maintains a stable place, always attracting the interest of serious students. He did not write a great deal, and of his works few receive much attention except the Ethics. It stands as a single work exacting a place of influence, usually reserved for a more extensive collection of philosophical writings. The figure of Spinoza has often attracted attention as his work, and he stands along with Socrates as one of the few genuine heroes in a field not much given to hero worship. A Jew ostracized by his own people and excluded from his homeland, he insisted on following his own ideas despite their heretical tendencies. However, the Ethics remained unpublished in Spinoza's lifetime. Upon this single posthumous work his great reputation and reservoir of influence depend. Hegel and many of the later Romantics acknowledged Spinoza as the modern thinker whose thought suggests the direction for their later developments. Widespread interest in Spinoza remains even today, despite his central theological orientation and the recent unfashionability of such an approach. Many men who find traditional religious beliefs unacceptable discover in Spinoza a rational and a naturalistic form of religion. His views on God, man and the human emotions have widespread popular influence. Although Spinoza is sometimes called the philosopher's philosopher because of the abstract and technical nature of the Ethics, it is still true that few philosophers' general views are more widely known than are his among the non-philosophical public. It is true that his views are often oversimplified, but it is also true that they are circulated extensively. A great deal of argument has been generated by the style or form in which Spinoza chose to write the Ethics. The continental rationalists, Descartes, Leibniz and Spinoza, were all much impressed by the exciting developments in mathematics, and all of them reflect something of the geometric temper in their writings. Spinoza elected to write the Ethics as a geometrical system, definitions, axioms, propositions and all. Some argue that this form is essential to Spinoza's doctrines. Others feel that the Ethics can just as easily be read in essay style. All seem agreed that the work does not really have the full deductive rigour of geometry, yet the form indicates Spinoza's desire to be clear and simple in his expression, to be straightforward in his assertions, and to connect the various parts of his thought systematically. All this he achieves with the barest minimum of explanation and with little external reference. Fortunately, Fortunately, we do not need to understand fully Spinoza's own attitude toward this geometrical method of philosophizing, or to appraise its success, in order to grasp the central features of Spinoza's thought. It is true that the geometrical method represents an attempted revolution in philosophical thought. In his Unfinished on the Improvement of the Understanding, Spinoza agreed with other modern revolutionaries of his era in stressing methodology and the need for a thorough re-examination of traditional philosophical and theological methods. His break with the scholastic method of the summa is complete. Spinoza firmly believed that intellect can be carefully examined and improved, and thereby made able to produce a more rigorous and more complete understanding of things, all this through its own strengthened power. Properly corrected, reason is self-sufficient, its own guide and its own judge, and this is for Spinoza as true in ethical affairs as in speculative matters. He does not belong in the class of dogmaticians. There is no indication that he believed his own views to be either complete or final. What is evident is his trust in the human intellect to work out an acceptable and a comprehensive schema. Spinoza depended heavily on previous theological views, but his modern temperament transformed them by placing them in a new humanistic perspective. The 5 parts of the ethics take up in order: God, the nature and origin of the mind, then the emotions, and finally the twin questions of human bondage and human freedom. In beginning with the consideration of the divine nature, and then developing all other theories in this light, Spinoza was influenced by medical theology. Theory of knowledge and attention to human powers of knowing received a more prominent place with Spinoza, but systematically speaking, a theory of the divine nature is still first. Spinoza called his first principle sometimes God, sometimes substance. Aristotle had defined substance as that capable of independent existence. Spinoza interpreted this with absolute rigor and asserted that only God, a substance of infinite attributes, could fulfill this definition exactly. The ethics opens with the traditional distinction between that which requires no external cause to account for its existence, cause of itself, and that which owes its existence causally to another being. That which is the cause of itself exists necessarily and needs nothing other than itself to be conceived. This Spinoza calls substance. On the other hand, what is finite is what is capable of being limited by another thing of its own kind, whereas substance is absolutely infinite in that it possesses infinite attributes. Spinoza defines an attribute as that which the mind sees as constituting the essence of substance. A mode is some modification of substance. Freedom means to exist from the necessity of one's own nature alone. Only substance as cause of itself fulfills this requirement, and to be set in action by oneself alone. Only substance or God is perfectly free, dependent on nothing else for its existence or action. It is absolutely infinite and thus one of a kind. From here, Spinoza turns to a classical definition of knowledge. We can say we know something only when we understand it through its causes. After this, he begins his famous proof that there could be only one substance, which would be absolutely infinite and thus be its own cause. These proofs are simply a modern version of the traditional arguments for God's existence, although in the ethics they take a novel form. The burden of Spinoza's point is that either nothing exists or else a substance absolutely infinite exists. Something does exist, and the presence of such an absolutely infinite substance precludes the existence of more than one such, and it includes everything else as part of itself. Since God or substance consists of infinite attributes, each one of which expresses eternal and infinite essence, God necessarily exists and excludes the existence of anything else not a part of it. Spinoza goes on to argue that such a substance cannot be divided, nor can the existence of a second such substance even be conceived. From this, Spinoza turns to the statement of perhaps his most famous doctrine: whatever is in God, and nothing can either be or be conceived without God. Popularly, this belief is called pantheism, but such a doctrine, that the world taken as a whole is God, is too simple to express Spinoza's view. It is not enough to say that the natural order as a whole is God, for what really is true is that Spinoza takes all of the usual transcendental qualities of a traditional God and combines them with the natural order, calls the sum of these God or substance absolutely infinite. Spinoza's famous doctrine of the infinite attributes of God is easy proof against a simple label of pantheism. In addition to God's infinity in such kind, in thought and extension, Spinoza posits an infinity of attributes as belonging to God, only two of which, thought and extension, are known directly in our natural world. Thus God, as Spinoza conceives him, is infinitely larger than our natural order, since the world we are familiar with actually represents only a very small part of his vast nature. This is a speculative doctrine, as intriguing as it is baffling in some ways. Since everything must be conceived through and has its existence in God, the knowledge of any natural event requires a reference to the divine nature. It is for this reason that Spinoza begins the Ethics with a discussion of God's nature, since the understanding of everything else, including man's ethical life, depends upon this. Nothing can be understood in isolation, and all adequate understanding involves locating the particular events and their immediate causes within the larger scheme of a substance absolutely infinite. God in traditional theology was used to explain the natural world as a whole. Now every phenomenon is to be seen as a part of him and is to be explained on a part-whole analogy. What it is true to say about the divine nature, then, is also in some sense true of every part of the natural world. Nothing remains unrealized in such a divine nature. Infinite numbers of things in infinite ways will all become real in the course of time. And time is without beginning or end. Rejecting medieval theories of creation, Spinoza returned to a more classical view of the world as eternal. The natural order is equal in duration with God. One side of his nature is timeless, but the side which includes the natural order is temporal. Time applies to God, but only to one aspect, and there are no alternatives to any natural fact, since infinite possibilities will all be realized eventually. God's existence is necessary, and so is his production of the natural order as a part of his nature. Although this production of the natural order is necessary, and its pattern without alternative, nothing outside God's own nature compels him to act, and in that sense God's activity is free. Yet God is absolutely the only genuinely free agent in nature. There is nothing contingent, but everything is determined necessarily, in whole or in part, by factors and causes outside its own nature. Will had been stressed as a causal agent in Duns Scotus, Again, Spinoza reverts to a more classical doctrine and denies that will can be a free cause. Will, he says, is nothing other than reason's tendency to recognize and to accept a true idea. Things could have been produced by God or by man in no other manner and in no other order than they are and were. In the appendix to Book 1, which contains the discussion of God's nature as it includes the world as a part, Spinoza goes on to elaborate his famous refutation of teleology. Christian doctrine necessarily depicts God as acting to achieve certain ends, or otherwise the drama of sin, atonement and salvation would be difficult to present. God acts to accomplish his purposes according to the orthodox conceptions. All of this Spinoza denied. According to the ethics, thought is only one of God's infinite attributes, so that although he is a personal being in some sense, he is so only in part. Will has been denied and thought is not dominant. Such a being cannot be said to act purposefully to attain an end unachievable without his conscious action. What happens in nature is simply the necessary outpouring of the divine, absolutely infinite substance, to which there is no alternative conceivable. Although Spinoza's first principle is different, he is very close to the traditional Neoplatonic theories of the necessary, although good, emanation of the world from God. So, that brings us to the end of Book 1. I shall continue with Book 2 next.